All right. We are studying faith development, or how you acquire faith and how that faith develops over time. And we have looked at several examples of specific people in the last few lessons about those people that we're familiar with, Peter and Abraham. And we're going to look at Gideon today. These people that have their faith challenged. And we know that that is a part of developing or maturing in our faith. If we're not tested, then we don't ever really know where we stand. We don't really know what we've gained. And that's just common. Probably most of us don't like tests. If you're like me, most occasions you get a test. Sometimes you can have a little test panic, and some people really lock up and they have difficulty with that. And not just a written test or a test you might take in school, but in life. Sometimes you might do real good on something, and other times, depending on the subject matter or your preparation or lack thereof, it can make all the difference in how you handle that test and how you demonstrate what you know or you don't know. And we know that through study and comfort in the scriptures, it gives us hope, but we do become a workman. And if we do it correctly, or at least we put forth our best effort and we own it when we don't, and then we get back in there and, roll our sleeves up and get back to it, then we can stand as a workman before God and not be ashamed. And the scriptures teach us that. And we've looked at several verses repeatedly, and this lesson is no different. And to me, it's wonderful because there's some of my favorite passages, primarily in James, where it talks about counting it all joy when you fall into different difficult situations from every side of all kinds of manner, and how we handle that. And we should still look at it and be joyful. When we do that balance of the end of the day or where we are in life, we should always be in the black. We should always be good, because we can be thankful. And again, that sends us to Philippians. We don't have to worry about anything, even in the trials and the tests of life. That's easier said than done. But it's a process that we learn, and we said that developing our faith is developing our trust in God. And we could go through the entire Bible, and I was having discussions with somebody this weekend about the promises of the Bible. How because the world gets bombarded, and sometimes we get bombarded by the world about the contradictions of the Bible, or all these, these discrepancies or different things. And I said, if you think you see a discrepancy, or you think you see a contradiction, look, like really dig into it right there. Because I promise you, when you start wrestling with that contradiction, you'll see that it's not a contradiction at all. That's going to be the area where you really see some deep nature of God. You see some evidence, some truth that's just undeniable. And I've actually been working on a sermon since probably the week I got here, still on my desk over at the office, and it's about the contradictions of the Bible. And but it's simple things, like how we become white as snow by washing in the crimson blood. There's all these mysteries of the Lord where he does things that seemingly would be impossible. And that's where you get the peace that passes understanding. Sometimes for even ourselves. Other people look and they say, wow, I don't know how you handled that. You're handling that so well. How you have such peace. And sometimes maybe we don't feel like we're handling it so good. We think, I feel like I'm just, barely hanging on, or I feel like I'm failing miserably. And they say, well, from my vantage, it seems like you're handling it pretty stoically, or you're handling it pretty peacefully. And Paul told us how he did that. And James 1 tells us how to do that. And Philippians 4 tells us how to do that. One of the key things is being thankful. Anytime we have this challenge of life, some hardship of life, if we can just shift our view, our perspective to gratitude, isn't that what it says? Be anxious in nothing. Don't worry about anything, but make your prayers and supplications known unto God. So your deep groanings, your utterances that sometimes you don't even know how to put it into words, like Romans 8 says. You let that be known unto God with thanksgiving. And then the peace of God that God will give us, the peace that passes all understanding, and it will guard our heart and our mind. And that's really what James 1 says. It says that you count it all joy. So what do? When everything's coming from every direction, you're thankful. You say, okay, I'm thankful, Lord, for what I do have, like the Apostle Paul continued in Philippians 4. So whether he's up high or he's down low, he's down low. He remembers when he was a time when he was up high, and when he's up high, he doesn't get too high because he remembers that sometimes he was abased. And that brings forth contentment. And so when we're thankful, then we can say, you know what? I don't have everything that I want, but I got everything that I need. And even this challenge is exercising me. You know, Jacob got his hip thrown out of joint wrestling with an angel, but he got a blessing too. And he wasn't going to let go of that angel till you give me a blessing. He got a name change, and a name that signified who he belonged to, Israel. And he got this blessing that was going to be this inheritance that's going to ensure him and his people, and really all nations of the earth, would be blessed like Abraham was promised, that we've already studied. And Jacob was one of those in succession. And so these repeated truths that happen over and over, they should give us comfort. And I was telling the person I was discussing these things with, they're talking about, some of my losses, that I've had in life. And I was looking at them and their losses, and I said, I don't know how you've handled the things that you've handled. I don't know that I can handle those. And I don't feel like I've handled mine very well. But we have this example of Job. We've talked about Job in the last couple of weeks. He lost everything. I mean, everything. His support from his wife, his friends. Everybody was falsely accusing him. And that was after he lost his 10 children and all of his physical possessions. And so there's no temptation that takes us. There's no challenge that we're going to face in life that's not common. And that's the conclusion me and my friend got to, is that, you know what? I don't understand everything you're going through, but I understand everything you're going through. Because, we all have highs and we have lows. We have triumphs and we have failures. And it's really what we do with that allows us to start to gain maturity. And sometimes, at least for me, I learn the most from the biggest setbacks or the biggest mistakes. It's kind of like I like to learn things the hard way, I guess, sometimes. I like to verify it, so I'll go ahead and make the same one, 2 or 3 times just to ensure that's not a very good idea. That's not the wise way, But sometimes, just like Moses, he thinks he's going to lead, and then he ends up being a murderer and going on the run for, several decades. David, he sinned pretty drastically. Had blood on his hands with Uriah because of Bathsheba. These examples show us that you can still be a person after God's own heart and be human. God mixed that in the equation, and that should give us some hope and comfort. And that's the only place that I find any security is in the idea of grace. And that's a habit I've been trying to to get to, because I can really get down on myself, and the devil has caused me to waste a lot of time spinning my wheels in regret. And if you can stay in grace, and that's what John said in John chapter 1. Dad refers to that passage, this section of passages, almost every sermon, because it goes hand in hand with this. If we think that we have no sin, if there's not something else we can work on, wrong, go check it and do inventory again, because there's something there that can be improved. There's something that can be corrected, but it's that, not that sinless perfection, as we talked about Wednesday night, but it's that obedience that makes us complete in our confession. So anytime, at any stage of life, no matter where we are, if we have already been washed in the blood and put in the body of Christ through baptism, all we have to do is say, here I am again, and confess that, before him, and the blood of Jesus Christ will cleanse us of our unrighteousness. And that should secure us. And I think sometimes that we beat ourselves up a little too much, and we beat each other up a little bit too much. And, if somebody keeps making the same mistake, we kind of really get down on them, and sometimes get a little frustrated, and then get a little disgusted with them, and have contempt for them, instead of being like, and then we need to realize that we're failing, because Christ told us to forgive our brother 70 times 7 in a day. And I do find comfort in that. We shouldn't continue in sin that grace may abound, but grace does abound. And we need to have confidence in the fact that God is going to love us through the process of life, whatever that is for all of us. And we need to try to do that for each other. So the more we can encourage each other to stay in those areas, in that place of grace, create the relationships that would help us to be open, a safe place so we could confess our faults, we could reveal our weaknesses, so that we can become aware of it, even if it takes somebody else telling us those things, and kind of pushing us in the right direction, or sometimes, like shoving us in the right direction, or, whatever it takes. And I think we have discussed that we could work on our relationships more, and the way that we communicate with each other to help each other provide that in a variety of ways. And today we're going to look at the example of Gideon. And, they were having difficult times there in Jerusalem. You remember the time of the judges? After they left Egypt and they wandered through the wilderness and they went and invaded and conquered Canaan. Then they had that time period after Joshua where, you remember, they didn't drive all the inhabitants out. And as Joshua ends and Judges begins, it goes through all the tribes, and every single one of them listed, it says, nevertheless, they did not drive them out. They didn't do all they were supposed to, and we've already discussed that in our class. That sometimes we get tripped up, or life gets a little harder than it has to be, because we didn't follow all the way through, or we kind of did what he said, but we really weren't completely, sold on it, or we gave up a little bit. I've had gardens that literally and figuratively that were busting out with fruit, and I got weary and well-doing. I got distracted, got bored, whatever, and just died on the vine. I look back and I'm thinking, man, how wasteful of the fruit, the yield, but also of the time and the energy spent. And so we need to have this perseverance so that we can make it through. And they found themselves in a difficult situation because they had not heeded everything that God had told them to do to protect themselves. So they made the challenges of life more difficult than they had to be. Another passage that is brought up several times in this course, or these different lessons, is where the disciples couldn't cast out the demon, the devil, out of that man's son, you remember. and he says, hey, I took him to your disciples, and they couldn't cast him out. And you remember Christ said, and that's in Matthew chapter 17, hey, some things you got to work a little harder at. And some people that are mature make it look easy. Christ made it look easy. His disciples thought, hey, well, you know, Jesus could cast them out. He gave us power to do it, so we can do it. And Jesus said, not without this one, you know, you can do it. And with God, you can do all things. But this one has to be done a particular way. And I was reminded of that. This was a comforting lesson for me, and the fact that the last thing that Stone gave me days before he passed was a drawing that he had made. And it was folded up, and it looked like an envelope. And it had, you know, a little stamp he drew on it that said Bible mail. And you open it up, and it had a picture, you know, typical kid, you know, the stick figure in the house. And but it was us, obviously, because of the drawing. We had a funny wheelbarrow that I've never seen one before or since, and he had drawn our little wheelbarrow, and he loved to get on the roof with me. And so he had me on the roof with a hammer, working, and with a big smile on my face. I thought, you know, that's a wonderful perspective for your child to see you working and happy about it. And because he had helped me do the church sign, I'm sure that's where he got this idea. At the top of it, it said, with God, all things are possible. And so you have this, you know, this idea that Christ is teaching them, like, look, some things seem impossible. And if you're relying on your own strength, and that's what is going to be the main idea of this lesson, is we can't depend on our own strength. Because it will eventually, even if it lasts for a while, there will be some things that are too challenging, too difficult, too lonely to face. And so, keeping that in mind, if we do those things during those times that would draw us closer to God, fasting and prayer, I mean, what more could you do to get closer to God? You know, be with some saints, some people that will fast and pray with you, like they did at the church in Antioch before they sent them out on the Paul and Barnabas on the mission journeys. You know, we talked about how do you know? How does God reveal these things and help you make decisions? And I appreciate some of you telling me some of your personal experiences about how God has helped you, you know, make decisions, or how things, what your experience was in that. But that's how they addressed that. When they had a decision to make, the whole congregation fasted and prayed together. Many times we don't discuss fasting in particular. We talk about prayer a lot. We talk about giving. But we neglect fasting. And fasting is a wonderful, it's really essential. And we know that it's essential, and that's how Christ was able to do it for 40 days. Because he had practiced that. And it was it was a custom. I mean, it was something that they made a part of their life. The Passover was a form of fasting. They had to remove all the leaven in their house. So sometimes we might say, you know what, I'm not going to eat any desserts or any sweets, or I'm going to avoid this. The husband and wife in 1 Corinthians 7. Sometimes the physical relationship that's not only okay and allowed, but wonderful. It's supposed to happen in a marriage relationship, but there's times when you decide purposefully to say, you know, we've been given this blessing by the Lord to sustain our physical bodies through food, to develop closeness and intimacy in our emotional relationship as a couple, but for the purpose of getting even closer in our intimate relationship with God spiritually, then we're going to avoid this. We're going to subdue that, fast from that part of our relationship, so that we can grow closer in our spiritual nature of God to bring the body into subjection. And so that's what fasting does, is it helps us draw closer in spirit to the Lord. And it helps us see that we're strong. And it quiets the mind and the body, the flesh, and eventually the flesh goes, okay. And the mind's like, all right, you're not going to listen to me, and they get quiet. And then the more subtle parts of ourselves, our heart, our conscience, our spirit, can begin. We can listen to that friend. You know, if you get me and Billy Wayne and Steve and Matt Franklin telling stories. You know, Joe's got some good ones too. You know, it'd be hard to get a word in edgewise sometimes. You get a quiet friend who's got some stories just as good, maybe better. We just might not have heard them because we don't listen to that quiet friend. We don't make the space sometimes. And there's aspects of our spiritual nature that I know I have, and I know from my observation that we have as a universal body of believers. We don't study that enough. We don't teach that. We don't practice that enough. And so part of our maturing in faith is looking at those things that are told specifically. And Christ said, when you pray, when you give, when you fast. He didn't say if, he said when. And so, and here, the point of the lesson is, if you want to grow to maturity, there's going to be some things that you can't accomplish. And if you're not able to accomplish it, you might have to say, you know, this isn't working for me. I'm going to have to dig a little deeper. And one of the things that we can use is withdrawing. It doesn't mean we have to withdraw from everything. We can, but we need to be able to have the discipline, develop the discipline to withdraw from it so that we can not need it and we can focus our attention on something else. Instead of worrying about what we're going to eat, you know, we think about what we're going to eat, what we're eating, and then God can reveal some things to us, and He'll draw closer to us because we are drawing closer to Him. Isn't that also what we learn in James? Draw nigh to God, and He'll draw nigh unto us. That's how we resist the devil. Jesus had already fasted for 40 days. He had already accomplished his task, and then the devil comes to him when he's weak. Oh, you're hungry? Go ahead, turn that stone to bread. Nope. I can fast a little longer. And so we can see that when Christ said his meat, what sustained him in life, wasn't bread. His meat, what fed him, what kept him alive and going, was to do the will of the Father which was in heaven. And so those are aspects that we need to draw closer to, that the author, that's why he brings those back out again, I'm sure, as we enter into this lesson. So I've already kind of introduced us to this idea of Gideon, and there's he goes into some beautiful passages about maturing, and he goes through some different translations on how different translators take that word and translate it, whether it's completeness or perfect. The Word of God makes us perfect. It's God-breathed, and it provides all these things. It teaches us in doctrine and correction and instruction that the man of God may be perfect, not just perfect, sinlessly perfect, but complete, mature, having those things that you need. And isn't that what James says? That we don't give up when it gets tough, but we count it all joy, and we let patience have its perfect work with us so that we can be what? Complete, so that we can be perfect. So if we endure, then we get to the other side of that, and then that's really, again, the wording is the same as Philippians 4, where our heart and our mind become protected. And so that's how we mature. If you give up too soon, then you don't get the gift. You don't get the blessing of the full harvest of that maturing process. And we talked about the Hebrews writer too, telling them that he loved to discuss some other things, but he was frustrated with them because they had backed up actually. And if we're not growing, if we are not increasing in our knowledge, in our service, in our patience, in our kindness, in our gentleness, in knowing how to season our words and our answers in just the right way for this person on this occasion, then we're not growing. And if you're not growing, we've already discussed that you're backing up. There's really no stagnancy is backing up. And so maturing is expected of us. Not only is it possible, but it's expected of us. And so in Judges, you remember that Gideon was at his threshing floor, and they were being, depending on the time, we looked at that at least in an overview when we went through the Judges, about, they would have spans of time, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 40 years, sometimes 60 years, where they would have some peace, and they would fall into that cycle of oppression again. They'd make life difficult for themselves. Not only had they not followed everything that God told them to do when they conquered the Promised Land by not driving all the inhabitants out, but then after a while, after the elders with Joshua's time period passed, and then future generations, it would say, how many times did we look at it? Said, and a generation arose that every man did that which was right on his own eyes. A generation arose that knew not God. So how many generations does it take for a nation to forget about God? One generation of a family not passing that on to someone else, becoming mature, and then showing those behind them, their children, how to mature. And so then they'd fall into that cycle of oppression again, and they would be oppressed by somebody, and then they would cry to God, please help us now that we're down again, and he'd send them a deliverer. And in this case, Gideon, it appears that he's, kind of hiding out, like he's in his own little world, and we can get like that, not that we're necessarily doing anything wrong, but we're kind of keeping to ourselves, and we're not really out there in the forefront, leading the charge, making sure the people are united, and making sure that everybody knows that this is God's people, kind of like David. There's lots of soldiers out there, and David's like, hey, I came to bring y'all some supplies and goodies from home, but y'all letting that uncircumcised Philistine talk about our God like that? I mean, come on, who's going to go do something about that? His brothers, be quiet. David was more mature than the king, the anointed king of Israel, Saul. Gideon is going to be implored to lead this resistance against the oppressors. And so you remember the Midianites, the land of Midian, and then the Amalekites who had gone to battle with them when they left Egypt. Remember when Moses held his hands up and they would win the battle, and then his hands would drop down and they would start to lose, and Ben I was going to say Ben, I guess because I was thinking of the movie Ben-Hur. Aaron and Hur held his arms up, and then they got tired, and so they stacked rocks up to keep his arms up high. And then later, Saul doesn't kill all the Amalekites like God told him to do. And so this is in the meantime. This is before Saul. This is in between Moses and the time where Saul was supposed to kill them and didn't. And they're causing problems. Another reason God is going to want them wiped out, because they just were not going to leave God's people alone. And we're going to see that in life. Sometimes people are just going to give us the business and make things difficult for us. And you remember that when they were going to go to battle with them, that they didn't really have, I mean, it seems like when you just look at the number, you got like 32,000 men to go in this army. You think, wow, that's a lot of people. But when you have a host that's innumerable, and we can begin to look at numbers that are become innumerable when we had the United Kingdom, and then it divided, and you had the northern tribe and the southern tribe, you remember. One time they went to battle, and there was 400,000 against 800,000. I mean, that's a lot of people. Over 1 million soldiers in battle together in a civil war. So when it says innumerable, then I have to believe that, man, that must be a lot, because these two armies actually ganged up together to fight against the people of Israel. And so God doesn't say, now I want you to go out and knock all the doors and get everybody stirred up, and then we'll have the numbers then. That's where we'll get our power. He says, I tell you what, let's see how many people will go to fight. And they have 32,000 soldiers. Probably a lot of them felt that they kind of had to, they got drafted. And then he says, I tell you what, if you want to go home, anybody that wants to go home, just go on home. And 22,000 of them went home. That's 2/3 of them. And then God says, I tell you what, why don't you go ahead and get rid of some more of them? And you remember they did the test with the water? How they were going to go up to the water and drink water. Are they going to get all the way down on the ground and lap it up like a dog? Or are they going to be aware of what's going on and still be able to drink, but be able to kind of see somebody that might come up on them? And so that was a part of the selecting process. And you remember that Gideon eliminates 9,700 more during that process, and is left with how many? 300. 300 soldiers against an innumerable host of two nations in their full armies. And on the surface, you would think, this is impossible. And sometimes in life, we face things. Maybe, it might be a challenging relationship. It may be a personal, difficulty or shortcoming. It may be trying to help somebody with something. It could be a sin. It could be somebody else's sin that you're having to forgive. Something that's challenging us, just like at the onset of this lesson with the demon that they couldn't cast out. And Christ, remember, he taught us that if you do it right and you put your trust in the Lord, it's kind of like a rich man. It's hard for a rich man to get into heaven, like we saw with the rich man who said, I'm doing everything right, aren't I, Lord? I go to church and I obeyed my parents, and I followed the commandments. And Jesus said, you want to have eternal life? Get rid of everything you got. Give it to the poor, and come on. And boy, his spirit changed, and he went away sorrowful. Why? Because he had great possessions. So here's a different occasion where Christ uses some of the same wording. And they're like, well, if some of these people can't get into heaven, then who can get into the kingdom? And Jesus said, hey, it's hard for a rich man to get into heaven. Because why? They're putting their trust. They can have the temptation to put their trust in themselves and think about what they did to gain those things. If you're not careful, you're the 5-talent man. You start thinking about, boy, I doubled all this. I had 5 talents, now I got 10 talents. And you have to remember, well, where'd you get your 5 talents from to begin with? Where'd you get what you were working with from the beginning? And if we all remember that God knit all of us in our mother's womb, then anything that we have in life every good and every perfect gift comes from the Father, who doesn't change. Again, we can trust him, and that's where we put our hope. And so, again, the same wording, he said, it's difficult with man, but with God, all things are possible. So when things get tough and we look outnumbered, sometimes God is putting us in a position, allowing us to be put in a position, because James also teaches that God doesn't tempt us. He can't be tempted, and he doesn't tempt us. But the tempter does, and he'll allow the tempter to the point that he knows that we can handle. He's faithful. He's not going to give us more than we can handle, 1 Corinthians 10 teaches us. And it's all common. We all go through it. And we should really, and I'm learning how to do this better. But I remember Curtis Capes, when he taught our Job class at the Memphis School of Preaching when I was in school. He did a wonderful job. You know, he said, boys, and he leaned back in his chair and spun his glasses around. He said, boys, when you fall into difficult situations, you need to realize that God's talking about you in heaven. And so if you're facing a challenge, God knows you can live up to it. And the more difficult the challenge, the more God believes in you. Yeah.
Going back to the first part of reducing Gideon.
Yeah.
You said that, you know, you go home, you go home. Well, that's a real nonchalant way of saying what God really said to him. He said, all of you that are fearful and afraid, depart on the morning. So
Very good. Thank you.
Not only, yeah, they could go home, and if
Yeah.
they wanted to, they could. That's true.
Thank you for.
The real reason
Mm-hmm.
is that because they were fearful and afraid. They didn't put their trust in the Lord to do that. And he didn't want that. Of course, he's got a different reason altogether too,
Mm-hmm.
but he exposed that we've got to have that confidence and that fearfulness that we're ready to go and do whatever God wants us to do, the way he wants us to, when he wants us to do it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
we can't, because probably the hardest thing for Christians or anybody to handle is good times or success.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to stay humble and remember that God's got to be in control of your life. You've got to be watching out for each and everything. When things are going wrong, it's hard to hit your knees and depend upon God. But it's not at that point. If things are going good, and then this comes along, and then that's what he says to him.
Mm-hmm.
And that remark just seems to humble me more,
Yeah.
knowing that I've got to be ready to say that I'm not fearful and I'm not afraid because God's on my side, and I know that. I got that confidence. I can stand like Shadrach, Meshach, and
Mm-hmm.
Abednego, or Daniel. Or
We may die, but he may save us too.
Right.
Yeah.
But if we die, we're going to go to heaven early.
Right.
If we stay, like Paul said, we're living for Christ. You know, so it's that confidence. We have to
Mm-hmm.
constantly keep having that confidence, not to get ourselves too high that we need to be brought down.
Right.
But we need to have that confidence so that we are putting God in front of us and guiding us, directing us, and we got confidence He's going to lead us to where we need to go.
And protect us in that process. And so thank you for bringing that out, because I actually looked at the word fearful when I was saying that, and I didn't draw it out. And to me, that is a very important piece of it, because what had God told Joshua when they entered into Canaan? I mean, the first 2 chapters, he says, you know, be of courage, be not afraid. Go conquer this land. You know, you're going to be outnumbered. You're going to have giants in the land. There's going to be situations, but I'm with you. And I think that phrase, if I'm not mistaken, I meant to look it up and I didn't. I think that phrase about not being fearful and being of good courage is if it's not the most, it's one of the most repeated phrases in the entire Bible. And God has not given us a spirit of fear. Again, I talked about trying to live in grace, remind myself that I'm in grace, that the blood of Christ is always there, especially if I own my difficulties or my shortcomings, and confess my faults. But also, he said, I have not given you a spirit of fear. I mean, David is a young boy, and he's like, I'm going to cut your head off today for talking about my Lord, my Father like that, my God. And he did with that one stone. I mean, boom, bullseye. He's given us a spirit of power and of love and self-control, temperate, soundness of mind. And so it does give us that confidence. When somebody's confident, they have a soundness of mind, right? They're in the thick of the battle. They're experiencing fear. They're experiencing that, but they're embracing it. And what C.S. Lewis said, that fear is not, or courage is not one of the virtues, but it's all of the virtues at their testing point. And so we have the opportunity to show our confidence and trust in God, to mature in our faith in all kinds of situations that might cause anxiety. And isn't that how we started the lesson about in Philippians 4? Don't worry about things. When things are going bad, James 1, have the confidence that God's going to see you through and get all the way through. And that's how we receive our crown of life. We don't receive our crown of life unless we're faithful even unto death, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, otherwise known, or more accurately known as Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And so God saw them through. There was a couple other points I wanted to bring out, but there always is. And so, yeah, we will pick up Wednesday night. The next lessons are on the back. If y'all needed one for today, there should be some extras back there. And, yep. Any other questions or comments? I love studying God's Word with you. So thanks for your comments and thanks for being here.